Let's get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, which is the online launch of the Waithood, the Experience of Waiting for Social Housing report. I want to start this event by acknowledging the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land that I'm coming to you from today. You may want to pop into the chat the beautiful country that you're joining us from today. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and really want to celebrate and acknowledge the strengths and power and diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing culture and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales and Australia. And in particular, I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues, peers, friends who are joining us today. Thanks so much for being here. Homelessness New South Wales is really excited to be able to host this event. It is such an important piece of research on the impact of the very long waits for social housing. I suspect that a lot of what we talk about today and what Alan and the team present won't be surprising to many of you, unfortunately, but gosh, this is some incredibly powerful evidence. And we've had a really strong response to attendance today. So it's really wonderful to see so many of you interested in this research and this issue more broadly. So today we'll open with a presentation from Alan Morris, who's the lead author of this research report, and then we'll move into a panel discussion and we'll talk about the lived experiences and the challenges, but also the opportunities for improvement on issues of wait lists and social housing and some of the practice and policy implications. The research report will be available to participants straight after the launch, and we'll make sure that you all have the link to that report. Some housekeeping. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat function. We'll be monitoring that throughout the session. The co-author of the report and research, Dr. Catherine Robinson, who's Associate Professor in Housing and Communities at Uni of Tasmania. She and the team will be monitoring that chat and may even respond to some questions directly in the chat if they relate to the research. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Alan Morris today. Alan's the lead author of the report. He's a professor of sociology in the Institute for Public Policy and Governance at the University of Technology, Sydney. His research interests include the impact of housing tenure, gentrification and displacement and urban marginality. His most recent book is The Private Rental Sector in Australia, Living with Uncertainty, and that was co-authored with Hal Pawson and Kath Holz. In 2019, his book Gentrification and Displacement, The Forced Relation of Public Housing Tenants in Inner Sydney was published by Springer. His book on the impact of housing tenure for older Australians, The Australian Dream Housing Experiences of Older Australians, you can see Alan holding that text in the image there, was published in 2016. So I'm delighted to hand over to Alan to start the presentation and talk us through the research. And after Alan finishes his presentation, I'll introduce our wonderful panel members. So over to you, Alan.
Right. Thanks very much, Kate. Much appreciated. We're just getting the technology sorted. Give us a moment.
Is this coming up? How about I go and share? Stop sharing. Okay. That one?
All right, thanks very much. Okay, so this report is called Waithood, the experiences of applying for and waiting for social housing. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land before we start, and before I start. And I'd like to thank Homelessness New South Wales for hosting this event. And obviously, I would like to acknowledge all the interviewees who really gave us amazing data and really opened up about their experiences of waiting for social housing. And also to my fellow authors and my fellow research team, thanks very much. Okay. So just to give a bit of context before I start going through the report. So what we have at the moment is about 175,000 people on the social housing waiting list. It's estimated, City Futures Research at UNSW has estimated that around 437,000 homes are needed right now for social housing. And if we add social housing and affordable housing, we have an unmet need of approximately 630,000. Sorry, this is blocked here. Okay. So in terms of clearly we have an enormous housing crisis. In terms of the aims of the report, I mean, what we wanted to do was give people in this situation, one of the most vulnerable groups in Australia, obviously, a voice. And we did that through these in-depth interviews, and we looked at the following aspects. Why do people apply for social housing? Waitie's experience of the, should be apostrophe, of the application process, the accommodation and living circumstances while waiting, the impacts of waiting, how Waitie's describe waiting for social housing, their views of the future, and the impacts of accessing social housing. So I'll go through these various the report, the presentation is organized around these headings. Okay, just before I get there, just to say something about the methodology. So the study covered 3 states, New South Wales, Queensland, and Tasmania. We conducted 75 interviews with people on the waiting list for social housing that we've called waitees. 30 were on the general waiting list and 45 on the priority. And then at the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, after the first round of interviews, we did a second round, so approximately a year after the first round of interviews, to ascertain what had happened to waitees in the year since their first interview, and we did another 42 interviews. So we have an enormous amount of data. Okay, so started off, why do people apply for social housing? So not surprisingly, the key factor at the time of applying is that they are experiencing an accommodation crisis, and social housing is viewed as the way to resolve the crisis. So just to go through some of the interview material. Amara in Tasmania was on JobSeeker and her rent account for almost all of her income. She had no idea how she was going to manage the latest increase. So this is what she said. It was gone up to $440. Then now they said they put it up $110. I'm now paying $550 a week. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do, and I need to move because this is so expensive. How I pay the house with a JobSeeker payment? How am I going to feed the kids, pay the school fees and everyone's clothes, everything? So a lot of incredible desperation. Katerina in Hobart has 2 young children. She could not afford private rental, and eventually she found herself homeless. At the time of the interview, she was in a shelter. This is what she said. So since 2019, I've been in and out of shelters. I was trying to find my own rental, and I'm still living to this day. I'm in a shelter right now. Yeah, I've got 10 weeks at the shelter now. And then after that, hopefully another woman's shelter will let me go there. If not, I'll be couch surfing again. It's hell. It's horrible. Jen had to move out of her social housing unit due to domestic violence. A lot of our interviewees had to escape domestic violence, approximately 30%. She was living in a shelter with her 3 children. I've been applying for private rental properties, but being a single mum on a Centrelink benefit, people don't want you in a house. I have no prior private rental history. I don't have a job, but how can I work? I'm driving shelter to shelter. So the impact on employment of not having affordable, secure housing was also very profound. I don't really go into that in this presentation. Okay, so moving on to Waitie's experience of the application process. So this depended a lot on the person's situation. The more complex their situation, the more evidence was required generally, and also their cultural capital, in other words, their level of literacy, their capacity to understand the form, answer the questions, etc. So a lot of evidence is potentially required. The form is quite complex. In New South Wales and Queensland, what we found was that often an advocate was necessary to get people over the line. And I'll just read you some quotes. So Olivia in New South Wales was only able to complete the application form when he was in hospital. But I tried to do it on my own before I went to hospital. I found it really difficult because of all the information and specifics that you needed. Well, I don't think anybody has all of the things that they asked for. So I found that really daunting when I first started. But then when I was in hospital, they did it for me, and that was a lot easier. Like when somebody like a professional, like they do that for their job to fill out these forms. So he really needed an advocate and eventually got onto the waiting list. Interestingly, we found that in Tasmania, the process was generally a lot easier for waitees. So everybody has to go through Housing Connect. 2 NGOs have been commissioned by Housing Tasmania to do all the applications, and this reduces contingency. It creates a far more level playing field. And almost all applicants in Tasmania found the process of applying fairly straightforward. So Mara said, I think it's very straightforward because I come here, Housing Connect, and they help me to do it. Yeah, help me to do the application and everything. So I think the Tasmanian model could really be maybe a model which all states could follow. One common feature in all 3 states, of course, is that all the waitees complained that they had no idea when they would be able to access social housing or if they would be able to access social housing. And this was a source of enormous frustration and anxiety. So Caitlin in Tasmania has 4 children and is on the general waiting list. I wish housing would improve on the way that they contact people on the list. I wish they would call them and just have a chat. I know there'll be 1,000 people that they have to call, but 1,000 people will feel more listened to and they'll feel more at ease knowing that maybe housing does actually give a shit. Okay. So moving on to accommodation and living circumstances while waiting. So generally, people were living in very unacceptable circumstances, living in unaffordable, insecure and poorly maintained private rental accommodation, around about a third of all the interviewees, sleeping rough, sleeping in cars or tents, staying at or rotating between the homes of friends and or family, couch surfing, living in short-term, temporary and emergency accommodation in motels or boarding houses. Generally, their accommodation situation caused an enormous amount of stress. Anastasia in New South Wales, a single parent on DSP, lives in a unit with her 2 teenage sons. Her rent, $400 a week, accounted for about 75% of her income. I'm renting a couple of things. I couldn't afford to buy anything, so I had to rent a fridge, and so that comes out of my pension as well and my car insurance to pay. So yeah, obviously any extraordinary expense creates a total crisis. Very often the conditions of the accommodation were very, very poor and unacceptable. Say in Susie's case, pervasive mold throughout the house had affected her health and her child's health. And she had to move all the possessions into one room. So this whole house was completely inundated with mold. And my daughter and I have been really sick since then. And we've lost a whole lot of our furniture and other belongings we've had to throw away. So now I'm just living in boxes because I thought our stuff would be safer packed away. And we're all bunked up in my room. It's the cleanest, most mold-free room of the house. Amy was pregnant when interviewed. She and her partner had been unable to find accommodation, and they were living in a tent. We've just been living in a tent underneath a family friend's house, but they're going through the estate or something, so that's going to come to an end. Of course, the solicitors are saying that we're prolonging the process. So real desperation. Shelters were, very often, obviously, very important, but they were very often very insecure and also very difficult in terms of privacy, etc. Jenna, at the time the interview, was facing homelessness as her lease was coming to an end. Yes, I've come straight from ex-shelter straight to here. I've been here now for 10 weeks. I have until next week, and then I'm going to be homeless again. I'm going to try the other shelters now and see if they have anything available. I'll just ring them every day and just try my hardest because there's nowhere else for me to go. I literally have nowhere. So this incredible anxiety and stress, obviously, as a lease comes to an end. Okay, sorry. So what I want to move on to now is the impacts of waiting, which obviously interacts with poverty. I mean, all the waitees generally had very few financial resources, but what we argue is that this waiting really accentuated the difficulties of everyday life. So for most waitees in the private rental sector, any extra expense provoked enormous financial stress. If one was having treatment that involved out-of-pocket expenses, it's very hard. I had to pay the other day $200 for the MRI. So once you pay the rent, and then you have to factor in that I need the injections in my back. So I won't get groceries this week. I'll just see what's in the cupboard. And you do have to make those choices all the time. There's different other medical things I should go to, but I can't afford it by the time the rent's paid and my medications. So people really had to cut back on these absolute necessities: food, medication, medical appointments, etc. Jackie, a job seeker in her mid-60s, couldn't afford to rent and was living in her car. She's been living in her car for about 2 years. I can't cook. Everything's got to be like a sandwich or a bag of salad or something. I've got to go to public toilets. I've got to go to a public place every day for a shower and to change, and I've got to pay for a laundromat. And, you know, it's fuel. It's quite expensive. My income is $40 a day. It doesn't cover food and laundromat and phone. The health impacts of waiting were generally very profound, mostly mental health impacts. For Pavaz, not having suitable accommodation was a source of enormous stress. He has 2 very disabled adult children that he has to care for 24/7. You know, low income, disabilities. I have things to worry about, but to worry about the most important thing, which is accommodation, suitable accommodation, that puts a huge burden on me psychologically and physically. Another quote around health impacts. Thea was in a shelter in Tasmania with her 3 children. The uncertainty associated with waiting had a major impact on her mental health. My anxiety has gone through the roof. It's affected my mental health. It makes me feel like I'm not good enough as a parent because I can't provide a stable home for my children. It's waiting is painful, it's stressful, lots of uncertainty. It really is hard. If it was just me, I could survive. But when I've got 3 little people that I've got to care for and provide for, that's when it gets very hard. So really incredibly, I suppose, emotionally draining interviews. The impacts on children were also quite profound. Lucy was living in temporary accommodation. She was adamant that her children had been removed because she did not have stable, affordable housing. So in the last 3 months, I've had my children removed from my care because I'm waiting for a house, a safe house. I just feel so saddened by the whole process. I just want to hide. Yeah, I've had DCJ just rip my life apart, pretty much, as well as being homeless. Very sad. Not having stable housing was having an enormous impact on Jenna's 3 children. My kids don't sleep. They don't have any kind of routine, nothing anymore, because we're just jumping. We don't have a stable house, so we're literally jumping from shelter to shelter. They can't settle anymore. Okay. Moving to how waitees described waiting for social housing. So we asked every waitee, every interviewee, we asked what words would you use to describe your wait for social housing, and the responses were quite dramatic. Amy emphasized how hard it was waiting. Rough, literally. I can't really describe it in any other way because it's been up and down, struggling with food, housing, general day-to-day activities. It's been hard, very hard. Waiting is the hardest thing possible to do because it's just waiting to get a call. Mia responded when she was asked the question, horrendous. I've got a few words: frustration, disappointment, nerve-wracking, just being beside myself sometimes. Why do I have to do this? Why do I have to keep moving and packing and finding places? It's soul-destroying, really. Soul-destroying is a good word, yeah. Kylie had been on the waiting list for several years. To wait on the waiting list, I find it to be, it's quite nerve-wracking. It's quite depressing just for the uncertainty of everything, you know. I feel like so many thoughts I have in my head. I'm just trying to pick the best one. I would say, yeah, to wait on the waiting list, it's kind of traumatic. Okay, so moving to views of the future. So we asked interviewees, how do they see the future? Very few were optimistic about the future, but most felt despondent and defeated, primarily due to being pessimistic about ever accessing social housing. Kylie in New South Wales was trying to remain positive, but was struggling. I try and be positive. I'm just trying to move forward and be positive. But for the future, I'm really, really uncertain. I do have hopes and aspirations, and hopefully they can be achieved. That starts by finding somewhere stable. So I think this issue, there was a general realization, general acceptance that finding stable housing was really the foundation for creating a decent life. Jenna had been forced to depend on temporary shelters for over a year. She was extremely negative about the future. I don't know if there's a future. I just take it day by day now. I can't set a goal or look what's going to happen next year or next week or next month, because there's nothing to look forward to. Yvonne was battling to retain a tenancy. She was fearful that in the future she may be forced to live in her car. Well, now I feel a little bit desperate at the thought of living full-time in my car. I worry about how I'm going to manage it. So my future is, I've already started looking at places where I can have a shower if I live in my car, but a little tiny tent here, I could possibly put that up somewhere. Pretty desperate. Okay, so moving to the last part of the interview data, the impacts of accessing social housing. So the second round of interviews allowed us to look at the impact. And generally, there was a massive improvement in health and quality of life. The quote from Jack in Tasmania are quite profound. They've given him the foundation to rebuild his life. But life, this is what he said, but life starts at a foundation, and that foundation is accommodation. Pretty much everything else around your life depends on good foundations of accommodation, everything from your community access, community contribution, ability to work, your friendships, connecting with family, pretty much every aspect of your well-being is all connected with that simple thing, your accommodation. It all stems from that. And now that I have certainty for the future, then there's finally a foundation on which to rebuild my life. Sorry, I can't read that one part there. So he felt he could now engage with the world again. The situation that I was in, there wasn't that foundation to be able to engage with the world. Now the goals have changed. It's changed from just survival to trying to engage with the world, to engage with the community, to be getting out of the house again. It feels possible to solve problems because I've got the foundation to build on. Very profound. Okay. Just very quickly, Wolf in Queensland have been moving between friends for an extended period. It's improved getting housing. It's improved my lifestyle heaps. Yeah, I've got a permanent place now that I can call mine, and the rent's affordable. It's all good, and I've got a little backyard. I've got a veggie garden. Yeah, it suits me to a T. I feel more secure, a lot more secure. Social housing definitely gives you a great independence and a place you can call your own. After initial apprehension, Amy said she is now settled and feels safe. I love it, I really do. This is definitely a comfort zone for me, and I really am very proud, proud of this place and stuff. Okay, moving to the conclusion. So I think, no doubt the interviews highlighted the daily struggles of individuals, couples and families surviving in tents, cars, caravans, motels and unsustainable rentals, and going hungry, cold and without medical treatment and medications. So we would argue that alongside social housing investment and dignified housing assessment processes, those waiting need an immediate response. This should include access to increased income support, crisis accommodation, and capped rental rises. And this will hopefully ensure that if and when social housing becomes available, those waiting are positioned as strongly as possible to rebuild their lives, so undermined through the limited provision of life's fundamental building block, affordable, secure, and adequate housing. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alan. And you may have noticed kind of furious nodding and and chatting between Thomas and I as you were making that presentation. And I'm sure that was a feeling across the group today. Really powerful, particularly those quotes. So we'll move into a panel discussion now to unpack some of these ideas. I realise I haven't introduced myself, and maybe I should do that before I introduce our wonderful panel. So I'm Kate Davies, and I'm the Manager of Policy and Research here at Homelessness New South Wales. So our fantastic panel this morning, who are going to join Alan to unpack some of these issues and explore what this means to people's lives and to practice and policy. Sitting next to me, I'm just absolutely delighted and privileged to introduce you to Thomas Sharp, who is a lived experience expert joining us on the panel today. Among Thomas's many accomplishments, he speaks 5 languages and is a professional translator in a number of languages. Is a TV game show quiz. In 2022, he beat the Beast to win the Chase Australia, and has upcoming appearances on Hard Quiz and the 1% Club. Thomas is also one of the many thousands of people on the social housing wait list in New South Wales and is currently living in a boarding house. We're really privileged to have Thomas share his expertise from living that experience of waithood, and that's an experience he describes as devastating, and Thomas will tell you more about that in a moment. Really delighted to welcome Karen Walsh to our panel. Hi, Karen. Karen's the CEO of Micah Projects in Queensland. So Karen's worked in the not-for-profit sector addressing homelessness since 1978. She's worked with many groups to create organisations and services to respond to local circumstances of people experiencing homelessness and the economic and social systems that create homelessness. She's worked with many population groups, including young people, young pregnant and parenting women, women and children escaping domestic violence, couples and families living on the streets in cars, parks and motels. Karen's particularly interested in how we create a more equitable and inclusive housing system that's affordable, secure, and has embedded services. She's advocated for housing first and supportive housing to form parts of our housing system. She's the chair of the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness, the CEO of Micah Projects, and that's an organisation that provides a range of services and is the backbone organisation for Brisbane Zero. We've got John Angler, who's the CEO of Shelter New South Wales, joining us, and John's been the CEO there since early 2020. John's been involved in the formation, development and operation of social, affordable and specialist housing for most of his professional life. He has a master's degree in urban and regional planning and has undertaken postgraduate legal studies. So having spent a number of years in the private, public and community sectors, John especially enjoys the opportunity to contribute to innovative housing responses and delivering solutions to those for whom the market falls short. So welcome to our wonderful panel members, and it's been great to see the research team members responding to some of those comments in the chat and providing some, particularly some updates on people's powerful stories. So I might pose the first question today to Thomas, who's sitting next to me in the room today. Thomas, just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that experience of waiting. You know, what does that feel like? What happens?
Look, I think that's a very interesting question. Yeah, as you mentioned, you know, I have 2 university degrees. I speak languages, but I'm one of the unfortunate ones that doesn't make a difference to. I've been sitting in housing commission offices. I've been on the wait list for more than a year now, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. I actually got a message yesterday from DCJ saying I'm required to send updates by the 25th of August with an urgent number to call. And I called them and they said, don't worry about it. So there's a lot of confusion regarding, yeah. But my story is, you know, I have a lot of friends in social housing. I'm not considered a priority housing candidate. However, you know, I'm on the list, but I also shared a email for an ABC interview I did a few months ago where I'm 57,000, I think, in line without priority. So yeah, it's devastating. I'm living in a boarding house right now. Yeah, life is like, if you'd told me 1 year ago that I'd be living in a boarding house waiting for social housing, I would have laughed at you. But that's the reality of my life right now, and something needs to be done about it.
Great, thank you, Thomas, and that lived experience expertise really needs to be at the core, at the guts of all of the changes and recommendations that inform these improvements to social housing. Karen, as someone who is working closely in this space, are there stories and lived experiences that you might be able to share about the real impacts for people on the wait list?
Good morning. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and acknowledge the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are probably on the waiting list or are homeless, and how that's been impacted by generations and has an intergenerational impact on how they see their lives and aspirations today. Look, I think the report is amazing, how it has captured the experience, and it's sort of, as I was reading through it again last night, it was like our inbox in our website at work, where people are emailing us, and which is just one way that people contact us, but often in that we've seen an increase. And I've often said at work, you know, gosh, the despair and the complexity that people are asking for assistance with has just, you know, increased to a level that is really at times just frightening. Like, you just want to go out and find those people and say, well, what can we do now? And finding people when they're emailing is quite a hard thing. You know, if they don't leave a phone number, if people's intermittent communication is really disrupted because they don't always have a phone, they don't always have internet. The administrative processes of applying for housing are really difficult, and whether people, even if they get on the list, how they can maintain the administrative compliance that they have to maintain. And I suppose, you know, we've seen housing grow into this high need housing. I would certainly advocate that we need to see social housing not just as high need, but for people on low incomes. And we do need some more specialist housing, which I would refer to as supportive housing, for people who have multiple needs and have had years of intergenerational poverty and trauma. And as the experiences in the report show, that, you know, homelessness and living in cars, tents, or couch surfing, or, you know, overcrowded housing, or even emergency accommodations, it both compounds the trauma that people have had in their past, as well as is creating new experiences of trauma. And that waiting and having a suspension in time of when am I going to be able to have a place to call home is very profound. And I think it comes through really significantly in the report.
Did you want to respond to any of that, Thomas? I know some of that was connecting.
Look, that's very, very true, Karen. The mental health aspect that the struggle to find housing has on people, you know, has devastating consequences. I've myself lost a couple of friends to suicide while waiting for housing. But it's not just my friends that, you know, it's affecting so many people all around Australia. And I think it's about time that something important and very, very urgently needs to be done about this.
Thank you. John, I might go across to you for the next question. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think are the problems? You know, what are the problems with the system, or, you know, the broader social, economic, attitudinal problems? You know, whatever aspects of this you want to talk about. Can you tell us a little bit about the problems and how they impact?
Thanks for that, Katie. And thanks for the opportunity. Thomas, thanks for that. That's really heartfelt. I too would, of course, like to acknowledge the traditional owners. One issue that I think we'll just flag and then park. One big area of homelessness, which we recognise interseasonally, is severe overcrowding. So, and we often think about severe overcrowding as part of, say, Indigenous communities. There's also a very big incidence of severe overcrowding in places in Sydney, southwest Sydney. What I think that issue touches on, and I was really pleased for those of you who were able to hear Minister Jackson yesterday talk about this, the personal stories are the things that transform politicians. We've got the stats, we've got the figures. So I really, really think it's so valuable, this work that you've contributed to, Thomas, today, that Alan's done, listening to Waithood. What I heard the minister say yesterday, and I think it is timely to talk about this, is those are the things that shifts. You can hear politicians' brains think differently when they realise it's the personal stories of transformation. So thank you. What I think the challenge for all of us is to take those stories and show how they are not one-off little examples here and there. They are part of a big broken housing system. The biggest issue we can start at a national level is that we have too much money stored in housing as an asset. Incomes haven't kept up with house prices. When that all filters down right on the ground, it creates really, really huge downward pressure right down on the very least affordable end of the market. Add to that the fact that governments over years have done not only not much, they've done less than much. They've sold off some existing stock that we have. We really are faced with a crisis, a perfect storm, unfortunately, of bad news. What I'm encouraged to hear, though, is that these stories increasingly show that, and I know Alan talks about this, housing is a human right. It's not something that we should just say is a one-off thing. We talk to welfare agencies, talk to your local charity. These are systemic infrastructure issues where we as a society have failed to invest significantly. So what I probably want to say at this group is we think that these issues are, and it was talked about yesterday with that great presentation from homelessness, it's not someone's fault. It's not you could have done something different, or had you made a different, sliding doors choice in life. This is a result. What we're seeing here are the artifacts of bad infrastructure decisions. So I want to make that point. What I'm also encouraged about is that this debate helps us move the dial from, if you like, the urgent. We get the urgent. There's things that have to happen now, but then there's also the important. And another analogy we use when it talks about health, we talk about chronic health issues as well as the acute ones. And I think the challenge for us is to be able to simultaneously look at both priority and general housing wait lists, because at the moment it looks like we're flat out just keeping up with people on priority, and that varies wildly, and Alan's research has shown that 55 if you're in Queensland or other states, 80 New South Wales. So even knowing what's the agreed definition of a priority is confusing. So I think two things: let's get an agreed definition of what's a priority. Let's start looking at some of the long-term things. And one of ours, as I touched on earlier, that we focus on at Shelter New South Wales is a bit more of an upstream one. I'm yet to see evidence of people who are in severe overcrowding. It's a big category of homelessness. In some areas, it can constitute up to 50% of the 6 categories that we use under the census of what's homelessness, the precarity. And we mean 8 people living in a 2-bedroom unit. What I'd probably like to see, based on the information I've heard today and this week, is a focus on doing something about that. We need in this case, New South Wales Land and Housing Corporation, when it combines to become Homes New South Wales with DCJ, to absolutely address the people who are waiting 10 years plus for a more than 3-bedroom dwelling. I think that's a really obvious manifestation of this. We know that we've got the urgent, 1 and 2 bedrooms priority. We've got the more long-term, the more chronic, which is the severe overcrowding, which needs to be addressed as well. So that's probably my general comment. I think today's the day that we've seen there's both systemic issues, but those personal stories like yours, Thomas, thank you, really do make people, politicians, policymakers, decision makers, hear it in a particular part of their brain that they wouldn't otherwise. So thank you.
Thanks so much, John. I might just ask Alan for a bit of a response, and then we'll go across to you, Karen.
Yeah, no, look, I agree with both Karen and John. I think the issue of housing being a human right is very, very significant. And we've got to treat it like health and education. I mean, everybody should have access to secure and affordable housing. And the other thing I would say, just in terms of the cost issue, if one looks at it from a purely, cost angle, I mean, the cost of not providing affordable and secure housing is incredible. I mean, as one can see, in terms of mental health issues, people being separated from their parents, being separated from their children, impacts, the intergenerational impact. So I really do think that besides a moral question, it's also really an economic question. And I think government needs to address it, both as a moral issue and as an economic issue. And it's a national crisis. I mean, this is a wealthy country and people living in these absolutely abysmal circumstances. And as a result, their lives can't progress, and if they had affordable and secure housing, they could, as that last quote from, I've forgotten the name, illustrated, once you have secure housing, your life can change very dramatically. You can re-enter employment, etc., etc. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Karen, did you want to add something to that discussion of the problems? What's going wrong and what are the impacts?
Oh, well, clearly what's going wrong is we don't have enough housing, or we wouldn't be trying to, work out who's prioritised, what's business as usual. I think one of the things we've really just got to look at is the length of time that people are on the list. And also, I think there's an urgent need for family housing as well as 1 and 2 bedroom units. I keep hearing people talk about 1 and 2 bedroom units, and I think, oh no, we need more than that. We need, 3 and 4 bedroom units. I think the constant theme in the report and the fragmentation and dislocation of people's lives reflects that we need more than housing policy to fix this. Like, we also need health, and we need child protection, and we need family support services. And that would prevent a lot of the things that are happening in those areas of social policy, which are also heading towards more prisons, more detention centres, longer stays in hospitals. So I think that the housing system alone can't fix this because it's been so neglected, but nothing can be done without the housing. So we need that investment, and it is the job of politicians to really look at equity and not just look at the behaviour of people and why they think they don't deserve resources, which is what has been the discourse for way too long. So I think it's important that these personal experiences are put before our representatives in parliaments, but we also need to remind them that it's their job to analyse and look at the distribution of resources, and we need more consistent resources going to housing every year. It can't be seen as just a reward every now and then. And what we've seen is just neglect for over 10 years of that. Stop blaming which government is doing it wrong. Like, the Commonwealth, state and local governments all need to work together, as do community services and churches, people with assets that could really contribute to a greater supply more urgently of the right kind of housing to meet the needs of people on the waiting list and all those that don't bother to even get on it.
Thanks, Karen. I'd really love all of these amazing guests and peers and colleagues and people living the experiences who have joined us today to come away with a sense of the ways forward and a bit of a call to action as well. Can anyone share thoughts on perhaps good things that you've seen happening? What are some lessons that we might be able to pick up on that can be replicated and rolled out more broadly, or thoughts about how we move forward from this? Do you want to go first, Thomas?
I was going to say, I think Tasmania is a great example. Looking at Tasmania compared to other states, they're leading the way in terms of housing issues. And yeah, I was just sharing before, maybe I should move to Tasmania. Maybe it'll make my life a bit easier. But yeah, I think we can learn from each other's improvements, not just mistakes, but where other states or other governments are doing well. I think we can certainly learn from their improvements. Absolutely.
Thanks. John, did you want to say something about that next?
Yeah, I think there's an old adage in Australia that says we all agree we've got one layer of government too many. We just can't decide which one it is we need to get rid of. The problem is that we need to get all three levels of government working. And what's really good, there's a layering effect, a cumulative effect, when you do have schemes, and there are various ones, nothing in any integrated way, but where the Commonwealth, for example, might provide the long-term funding, the state might provide the land, and local councils might provide the planning regulation that allows it on one of those things. So this idea that somehow it's a mystery, we don't know what to do. It's as simple as, and there's something happening in New South Wales today, one of the Inner West Council of Sydney, literally having to lean in and say, actually, it is our issue. So funnily enough, when we talk about the Prime Minister, and he's changed his language a bit about this, the Prime Minister grew up in council housing. It was built by the City of South Sydney Council Housing. It was then taken over by the state. It was public housing. But it's important to hear that local councils can actually be part of the solution. They don't need to say, oh, that's all the state's issue or the Commonwealth's. I think similarly at the moment, we're watching where it's no longer good enough to say that the Commonwealth has nothing to do with rental reform. Clearly, there's an appetite, particularly for young renters who vote. They're saying to the Commonwealth, you really do need to be involved in rental reform at a national level. So whatever that looks like, I think gone are the days we can say, oh, that's the state's responsibility or that's the local. What we really want to see is the wonderful cumulative effect when all three layers of government work together. They provide the land, they provide the capital, and they provide the ongoing operational costs. That's where we see really, really good things happening. So yeah, I'm emboldened by examples. I wish I had some really good defined ones to give you, desperately looking for them, but where state, federal and local work together, magic can happen. Happy to hear any examples of any of my peers or colleagues who have that, where that's working particularly. We need to roll it out across the country.
Here. Thanks, John. Alan, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think, one looks at it historically, and we forget between 1985 and 1995, about 115,000 social housing dwellings were built, which is around about more than 10,000 a year. We also have the response to the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, 2010, where around 20,000 homes were built. So it is possible, but I think, what is required is really, the admitting that this is a national crisis and an enormous amount of resources have to be devoted to it. We seem to be able to find money for submarines, but we can't find money for social housing. I mean, this future fund, is fine, but really it's a drop in the ocean in terms of actually starting to resolve the issue.
Thank you. Karen, thoughts on the way forward, perhaps visions for the future?
Well, I love the heading in chapter 9 of the joy of feeling at home, safe and comfortable. And I think that we need to bring that narrative to policy so that we don't just build housing that then the community thinks is the slums, or talks about it as we don't want those people in our neighbourhood. We really need to have communities embrace social housing as a community asset, and that we need governments to recognise that you've got to put in the infrastructure to make that housing work in the way it's designed, and also when necessary to have security in the buildings and support and healthcare. Not all housing needs that. There's many, many designs. There's, great people who have got architects and people who know how to design community enriched neighbourhoods, and that's what we've got to do. That we've got to make sure we don't keep the stigma that's associated with social housing. It's, if you listen to families or people who are moving from in a transition of life from having a family in public housing to going into a smaller housing, they all talk about, the success that stability gave them, that their children could go to the same school, that they were near public transport and get to their job. And I think we've just really got to change that discourse and the stigma that's come with public housing or social housing, and make sure we all do our bit to see it as both a community asset and something that is a human right and that will be healthier for individuals, families and communities.
Thanks. Thanks, Karen. You're getting furious agreement from the three of us here. And thank you to, I'm just checking who, Kylie, who posted the note about the Australian government yesterday released the issues paper for consultation on the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. So certainly encourage everyone to get onto that and to make sure that as many voices are heard in that process as possible. We might throw to a couple of questions from our guests today, and thanks to, I think, Joelle and Catherine have been furiously responding to some questions in the chat. But perhaps if people would like to pose a question to the panel, maybe use the raise hand icon, and we'll take a few questions. Oh, and Jan as well. Thank you. If you have a question directly for the panel now as well, perhaps type it in the chat while we're looking directly at it.
Somebody wants to comment.
But Kate,
Yeah,
can I just add one thing? Sorry, just as Karen was talking, she reminded me, you know, sometimes it's hard to say, what does good look like? So one of the things that we know, CHPs, who are a big part of this, they've been sponsors as part of the work that's been happening for Alan's work, for example, they often struggle having meaningful representation of residents even on their various committees and boards. I would love to be delighted and be surprised to know that a CHP had formal representation by people on the waiting list. Hard thing to do, but I think Alan's research has shown us it is possible to get to the waiting list and get good qualitative, subjective, meaningful data. I would really like to see, and we've certainly put the challenge to the New South Wales government to say, if you're going to do things differently, one of the things you could do is recognise people on the wait list as part of formal committees, either through CHPs or other mechanisms. Great that we have existing residents. That's a bare minimum. What I think would be an excellent standard is to have people who are on the waiting list. They are the silent shareholders, if you like, about what's going on. They need to be able to keep CHP boards, various organisations, honest and committed to what they're doing. What have you done for me? I'm on the waiting list. I think is a really good, important question that all CHPs, boards, management should be asked regularly. What have you done for the waiting list this week?
Wonderful, thanks, John. And I think this research makes such a powerful contribution to kind of starting that process. Thomas, there's a question for you there in the chat about being on the wait list and how you know what's going on.
Yeah, Craig, thank you very much for that question. In short, I was told that I was looking upwards of 10 years at best. Even though I had priority housing, it was still a 1-year minimum. But yeah, I was told I had to move like elsewhere in Sydney, southwest, far out west, but I wasn't given an exact time frame, so to speak. I was told that yeah, I would be waiting a long time. I wasn't given an exact time frame.
That seems to be the story of what's come out in the research, Alan, right? That sure. Uncertainty. Yeah.
Well, people on the general waiting list could wait forever, wait their whole lives basically. And to get onto priority list, you have to have very, very complex needs now. So it's becoming, and that's a real problem, because also what is happening is that social housing becomes more and more residualized. A lot of, there's the potential for having a difficult neighbor who's, so it creates a whole lot of unintended consequences, the shortage too. But people on the general waiting list could really be waiting forever.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I saw a hand raised. If there was someone with their hand raised, just turn on your microphone and ask your question. Saw a hand and then it disappeared for me.
Oh, hi. So my name's Jessica. I work for Link Wentworth Community Housing. I'm actually a part of our specialist homelessness services. So I just wanted to say that this is an incredible resource. And for me, especially, I'm in a unique position being in a CHP and an SHS service. And I guess that allows us to have a little bit more knowledge than, the stock standard SHS outside in the general public. And I can tell you that all of the frustrations and, things that you guys are experiencing, as someone who's co-located in something, I still experience on the daily. And there, whilst I might know every trick of the trade to try and manipulate the situation, like I know how to write a briefing note and I know how to make things tick those boxes for priority. We even get told by our local, like we know we don't have the properties, and it's super disheartening. And you know, the relationships that we have with the local DCJ office, we actually offer assertive outreach with DCJ and work collaboratively with them, and there's just not the stock. And it's really hard for like the areas that we work in are places like the Blue Mountains and the Hawkesbury and things like that, where we hold the devil's share of the properties, and there's just that push and pull from government to say, oh, well, we'll just fix it. But we don't have the funding because we don't have the properties, because there's just, you know, all those other frustrations. And it's really hard to try and explain to someone who has, you know, very complex medical needs and can't leave an area to say, sorry, but priority housing still 10 years plus, because that's the reality of what we're sitting at now. So, and like even in like as a SHS, we don't have transitional housing to offer either. We don't have solutions, but I know that as our CEO is super keen to help in any way that they can, try and, you know, collaborate. So anything we can do or information we can share, I'm sure we'd be more than happy to do that, to act from that side. So thank you though.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Jessica. And I think the experiences of kind of being in the front line, working in these spaces every day, really resonate with a lot of people, I think. And you know, that heartbreak of being on either side of the story. I'm mindful that we've come to time. I feel like we could easily speak for another hour or so about this, and you know, certainly encourage you to get in touch. You know, I'm happy to take emails if people would like to follow up any questions with the panel. The link to the report has just been shared there in the chat by Rennie. If you haven't had a look at the report yet, I really urge you to. It is powerful, and the stories will really connect with you. So please do access the report and use that incredible evidence base to continue and inform our lobbying and advocacy and shaping and redesigning the system. I think Rennie's going to share a link to a feedback survey. We'd really love your feedback on this event and want to continue delivering meaningful evidence and, you know, getting powerful information and research out there. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and a big thank you to our panel members, John, Karen, Thomas, and to the whole research team, Alan and crew. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.